One of the most exciting young players in chess is rapidly rising Grandmaster Hans Niemann, an American, only 18 years of age, getting close to 2,700. This game today is a game he has played at the Prague Festival Masters in 2022. His opponent is Grandmaster Hracek, who's rated 2570. And the reason I'm presenting this to you is because it's such a great, brilliant attacking game. I mean, I'm just going to give away the ending right now. Hans Niemann just demolishes the Sicilian Najdorf. It's really fun chess and great to watch. I hope you enjoy it. Let's begin. Hans Niemann has the white pieces. Grandmaster Hracek has the black pieces. E4, C5, and we quickly get the main line of the Najdorf variation. The idea, of course, is to play e6 and control b5. Black would like to play e5, and without a knight being able to move to the b5 square. Hans Niemann plays bishop to g5, the absolute main line of the Najdorf and the sharpest line as well. Uh, e6 is the move that's played after bishop to g5. Basically, he takes away black's option to play e5. If black plays e5 now, then the bishop is already in a position to take the knight, and white can hop right into the weakened d5 square. So bishop g5 pretty much forces the move e6. Not completely forces, but almost. f4, bishop to e7, queen to f3. The queen is trying to make it so black can't play b5. If he does, white can play e5, attacking the knight and the rook at a8. And keep this idea in mind because it ends up coming up later in the game. Knight b to d7, long castling, and h6. Black asks the question of the bishop, what are you going to do? You going to play back to h4, or are you going to capture on f6? And Hans Niemann goes ahead and takes on f6. Bishop f6, and now bishop to c4, the most aggressive posting of the light-squared bishop. The idea is that he would like to sacrifice it on e6, and after he takes, knight takes e6, and black's position would be lost. But instead, Hracek, of course, just castles, and he's safe from the sacrifice. Now, g4, Hans Niemann gains space on the king side, attacking the king. And now b5 is the response. The better move looks to be e5. Black's doing fairly well here. Looks like an equal position. One really cool line is knight to f5. After pawn takes, rook takes d6. And if bishop to e5, he can actually play rook takes h6, and this forces a draw. Knight h6, king g7, and goes back and forth. If the king moves away from one of these two squares, white is able to get into the position with knight to d5 and queen to h3. But instead of the better e5, black plays b5, and now the move we talked about earlier, boom, e5 is played. The e-pawn attacks the bishop at f6, the queen hits the rook at a8, and black has to make a decision. And he really, I mean, there's no good choice, but he makes probably the best decision. He goes ahead and takes the pawn on e5 with his bishop, getting two pawns in exchange for one piece. If he just takes the pawn, then knight takes e6. It hits the queen, so it has to be recaptured. Bishop e6 check, king to h8, then queen takes rook, and white has a decisive material advantage. So bishop takes pawn. Uh, Pawn takes bishop. He doesn't want to just take the rook here because bishop takes f4 check, king moves, and pawn takes bishop. And black's still very much in the game at this point. But instead, pawn takes, and here black plays d5, because now if he were to take the bishop, the queen would just take the rook. So d5 blocks the queen, so it can't take the rook anymore. The bishop retreats to b3, and now black grabs the second pawn. Knight takes e5, then also hits the queen. The queen moves to g3, and the knight moves to the nice square on c4. So white has a piece, black has two pawns, and a really nice pawn structure. But that's not nearly enough compensation because white's going to be able to attack black's king. That's really where the big advantage lies. h4, continuing to gain space on the king side. Queen to d6. Actually, black would like to trade queens. After, say, queen d6, knight d6, white still has a winning advantage here, but black with the nice central pawns might be able to survive an endgame. But Hans Niemann says, no, I want to keep queens on the board, continue my attack. Rook to b8 supports perhaps a push of the b pawn, but more importantly, sets up The bishop moving to b7. Perhaps that can cause some trouble down the long diagonal. g5 and h5. It looks like this is just losing the h-pawn for no compensation, but actually after queen takes pawn, which Hans Niemann does not play, then queen to f4 check, and that forces the king to b1, and then knight to d2, excuse me, forks and blocks the rook's protection of the knight on d4. He'd have to give up the exchange, and material is actually equal here, but white still has a clear advantage because after queen g4, h5, h6, he's still attacking quite viciously on the king side. But instead of going down that variation, Hans Niemann just moves the king to b1, so that's no longer an issue. Now the pawn does hang, and g6 protects it, rook h to e1, and now the pieces are all centralized. The weak dark squares are over here around black's king, and he's ready for his final attack. Bishop to d7, queen to f6, going into the heart of black's position and having a very nasty threat. If it were white's move here, he could play bishop takes knight, pawn takes, and then knight to f5 would be a very strong move because the pawn is pinned to the queen. And if pawn takes, then knight takes d5. Again, the pawn is pinned, threatening knight to e7. Rook goes in, g6, rook f8 to defend f7. Otherwise, he just plays queen f7, queen h7 mate, and then rook to g1. And the mate is forced. The game would be over. That's the threat that comes with the move queen to f6. So to defend against that threat, black plays rook to b6 to defend the queen, and now there's no longer a lateral pin along that line. The knight goes to f3, allows the queen to defend along this diagonal, maybe settle on the d4 square. And also there's the possibility of taking the knight and playing knight e5, knight takes g6, tearing open black's king side. a5, queen to d4, and here the threat is bishop takes knight, followed by knight e4, for example, takes and then knight e4, threatening the queen and also a check on f6, which would essentially decide the game. So black sidesteps that by playing queen to c7, but then bishop takes, pawn takes, knight to e5. Now the knight is threatening all kinds of potential sacrifices on the king side. Rook f to b8. Black counterattacks the b2 pawn, but it's too late. Knight takes f7, king takes f7, queen to f6 check, king to e8. And here, Hans Niemann could have played knight to d5, possibly, but he wants to keep more control over the position with checks. So queen to h8 check, king at f7. He can't play king to e7 because of knight to d5 check. The pawn is pinned, so he can't take the knight. The queen would be lost. So he wants to stay off that e-file. King to f7, queen h7, king f8, rook f1 check. Now he moves to the e-file because there's no longer a pin along the e-file. Queen g6 check, king e7. And here comes the final devastating blow. Knight to d5 check. Even though the pawn is no longer pinned, knight takes d5 is still decisive. Pawn takes, obviously if he just plays king to d6, he just takes the queen. Pawn takes, rook f7 check. And here, Grandmaster Hracek resigned. And what would have happened in the rest of the game is king to d8, rook to f8 check, king to e7, queen to f7 check, king d6, using this pawn as a shield. So in order to deliver the mate, you just remove the pawn as the shield. Queen to d5 check, king to f7. Now the queen just goes back to f7. And this time it's mate because the rook at d1 is no longer blocked by the pawn. So a really devastating attack against the Najdorf. Very exciting chess. Look forward to more from Hans Niemann. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.